sometimes, we're so focusing on the project plan and we forget about, okay, let's try to measure our success factors and some of the very critical KPIs to the project. I was always a big fan of TTV, time to value. If you're thinking about time to value as the most critical piece, you can break down your success into small pieces of deliverables, and each one of those deliverables will give you the value as soon as possible. So I like to be always very aggressive with TTV when we're thinking about system and processes, and I usually would even try to put it into the range of 4 weeks to see initial value. It really, I see your kind of face. Absolutely, 4 to 8 weeks, I would definitely try.
Hello and welcome to Tech for Finance, where we help finance professionals leverage technology to level up their lives. I'm your host, Adam Shilton, and today we're joined by Dr Liren Edelist. With a PhD in Business Administration and an MBA in Business Management, Liran is a strategic executive leader known for his extensive experience and proven track record of fostering business growth from startups all the way to Fortune 100 giants. Liran brings over 20 years of experience in EPM as a founder of a consulting firm and the former global head of customer success and North America president of Jedox. Outside of the boardroom, Liran is an accomplished author with publications that delve into the intricate world of software costing and business ethics, and he's also a teaching professor. In his spare time, Liran likes to spend time with his 3 kids and his wife, and they go hiking, cycling, skiing, and go to amusement parks, so I hear. But before we start, if you like what you hear today, don't forget to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform and on YouTube. But it's amazing to have you with us today, Liran. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. So happy to be here and love your podcast. So
thanks ever so much. No, it is great and excited to have the conversation. So I know we've got a bit of a hard stop, so we can go straight into it. So over to you. Do you want to start giving a bit of background? Focus of this session is EPM, CPM. So do you want to take us through your approach, give us a bit of introduction to the way that we work, and then we can go from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I can start, my approach to EPM, CPM started about 20 years ago, as you mentioned in your intro. And we used to call that office of the CFO at that time, or a budgeting solution, right? And over time, it was evolving to many different areas and ideas. And I think even nowadays, no one knows how to really call that. Is it like FP&A, XP&A, EPM, CPM, right? Giving the name. So I would like to take a little bit of a different angle and speak with you about the conversation I had with a friend of mine. He's a startup founder, very successful one. And I spoke with him a little bit about this market, and his reaction was, hey, for me as a founder and a CEO of a growing company, the FP&A guy and the guys who gave me the data were the most important people to me. So I'm giving that example maybe just to speak a little bit about my approach or the way I see EPM and CPM. I think, whatever we're doing, whether, those are FP&A professionals that are producing the data, if those are consultants that are helping them with or without technology, I think we have to make sure that what we're doing with the EPM would be the most valuable insights we can bring to the CEO or to the management teams, right? So I think we need to start with that. Now, then, we can take EPM and CPM and make it kind of parallel to the stage where the business is, right? So if it's a business that is just starting and growing, then by nature, maybe the basic stuff to give them is just the financial information and some other one. But if we're talking about growing companies, about more complex organization, it is much beyond the financial data or the budget planning and forecasting, right? It's literally how business processes are working in the business, how they can be optimized, what value creation the company is doing, and how can it create this value in a more productive way that can get more money and growth to the organization, right? So I think that's kind of the overall way to think about EPM and CPM. And then we can think a little bit about the technologies, and we have to make sure that the technologies are aligning with the goal of the EPM and not just about is it Excel or web-based platform, right?
Yeah, and I totally agree. Um, and I mean, I suppose coming back to something else that we obviously mentioned in the intro, which was your experience as the head of customer success when you were at Jedox, right? So now with you obviously running your own consulting firm, what does success look like to you? So if you're speaking with a company, and if obviously they approach you with a challenge, right, to say, look, we're struggling here, we need insight here, or we need to tweak process here. What are you working towards when we're thinking about outcomes?
Right. So the way I think about customer success in our space of, let's call it, business planning and analysis
Hmm.
is with all of the technology and the challenges, some economy situation that is not overly comfortable and a lot of new technology coming in. I like to think about customer success through the eyes of business transformation.
Hmm.
I like to think about that. What is the potential value that the organization needs, and how this potential value can be optimized through the eyes or the hands or the technology that is coming with that, enterprise performance management solutions. Um, One of the key differentiations here is that, if you go, let's say, and implement a project management solution, right, the cloud project management solution, what you get there is a sort of a methodology that is in many cases very well used and known,
Hmm.
and you get a tool that help you to manage that known methodology. I think the business planning and analysis is very different in the sense that it should be taking the business from point A to B, and not each and every business are in the same way. So what I'm trying to say here, it's not a process that is well defined in advance. It's very customized to the needs of the organization that is using the EPM. So if there is an organization that is really struggling with growth, right, you need to think how the EPM technology will help to get the right insights and understand how you can do growth better, and do some analysis on your customer base, on success, on failure, and that kind of stuff. But if your organization is more in the cost saving area, then there are different activities to do, to focus on cost saving. And then again, you need to understand the business processes to implement that. And that's, the way I'm seeing, the success with a EPM solution different than others. But also, I'm thinking about that from the business value that might be different than just taking a technology and say, okay, now I'm implementing like a production system for whatever, like a CRM or EPM. I'm sorry, or project management solution in that sense.
So forgive my ignorance here. Um, so my background in technology is ERP, CRM, those sorts of, I guess, mid market, I guess more operationally focused systems. So when we talk about EPM here, um, are we talking about a combination of applications, i.e., an ecosystem? Can we class enterprise performance management as an ecosystem of applications, or in the world that you come from, is the EPM a solution in its own right?
So, because I'm having like two, in a way, two diverse backgrounds. I was serving as a consultant,
Mm.
completely like technology agnostic, and I was in the side of the software vendor. So I think most software vendors would like to think about EPM as a sole solution, as a
Mhm.
technology, right? That can give you everything you need in order to manage your financial data, planning, forecasting, and reporting. However, I think that EPM is a concept more than a tool, because you can say that the BI system is an EPM as well, right?
Mhm.
But then it will not definitely be comprehensive. So I think we need to, as a customer or as a consultant, I think we need to think about EPM as a concept that includes different business activities and create a certain business value to the organization,
Mhm.
right? And potentially EPM tools will be the way to implement it. Some vendors will say you need only one EPM tool to do it all, and some will say, well, maybe you do planning in one tool and reporting in the other, right? You can always combine a planning tool with a BI system as an example, right? But I think the stage is really to identify what is the scope of EPM that the organization really needs.
Mm-hmm.
What are the stages, like what is the roadmap to a full EPM transformation or a full business transformation around that? And then, you should say, okay, do I need one tool or more?
Okay, that's fine. And going back to what you said there, we need to define what the end goal is at the end of the day. Yeah, especially with the amount of tools that are now available on the market, right? It's giving everybody headaches, but maybe a conversation for a different day, right? So coming back to sorry, we've gone off on a bit of a tangent. Coming back to the customer success piece. So obviously you're quite qualified when it comes to business and all of those sorts of things. So you probably are a lot more familiar with the concept of KPIs, OKRs, all of that sort of stuff. So from the perspective of a customer that's going through transformation, whether it's a combined platform, multiple solutions, or whatever, in terms of success, what KPIs do they need to focus on? So maybe it's also valid to outline maybe some bad KPIs as well, because sometimes it's just as good to be able to filter out the poor as well as focus on the good, right? So I don't know whether you could talk around that a little bit, and whether there's maybe one that people need to focus on above others. It'd be great to get your perspective there.
Right. So, great question. And thank you for asking, because I think the first piece to remember is that, regardless if we're implementing an ERP or an EPM solution, we need to make sure that we put those KPIs and the measurement system in place, right? It goes without saying, but sometimes, we're so focusing on the project plan, then we forget about, okay, let's try to measure our success factors and some of the very critical KPIs to the project. However, in that space of EPM, I was always a big fan of TTV, time to value. Which for some reason, in many cases, people forget about it. Now, the reason I like the time to value is because you can really think about the time. If you're thinking about time to value as the most critical piece, you can break down your success into small pieces of deliverables, and each one of those deliverables will give you the value as soon as possible. Now, it goes into several other areas, like with other system, we always want easy adaptation to the system, right? And you're starting to get the value from a system with adaptation. So if the time to value for a system is taking too many weeks, it means that the adaptation is also difficult, right? So I like to be always very aggressive with TTV when we're thinking about system and processes, and I usually would even try to put it into the range of 4 weeks to see initial value from a system between 4 and 8 weeks. It really, I see your kind of face. Absolutely, 4 to 8 weeks, I would definitely try. Now, see, here is the challenge here. Maybe with the key differentiation between an operational system or a transactional system like ERP, you cannot get value from ERP within a week, right? It takes a couple of months until you just run through the implementation. And the EPM space have to provide tools for the end user to be agile and flexible. And, many of the EPM vendors, they're saying that they are enhancing, some of them saying they are replacing Excel, right? So if you're an FP&A expert, you will not lose your Excel flexibility into something that is much more complicated than that you cannot maintain, right? So if that's the mindset, then why would the TTV will be more than a couple of weeks, right? If it takes a couple of months, it means that you're building a sort of a big monster that will be very difficult to maintain and use. So I like to think about TTV as something, what are the short-term outcomes that can be delivered to the customer, so he will be able to start engaging with the system. He will be able to start produce value. And if you cannot get TTV in, let's say, the 2 months time frame, I would be trying to rethink about either the technology or the project plan.
I think that's really useful. So And this applies to sort of any, I mean, maybe not even just tech decisions, but resourcing decisions, and anything that has a potential cost associated with it. And I've got another question for you related to one of your publications in a second, but we'll get onto that. But I think just asking that question, do we believe we will see fast value from this, is a good filter. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think coming back to what we mentioned about outcomes, KPIs, that sort of stuff as well. And I did, as you know, I have quite a lot of conversations with companies that are going through some sort of tech adoption, as you say, whether it's moving away from Excel or upgrading finance systems or whatever it happens to be. And what I see time and time again, and you probably see this as well, is companies kind of only see the four walls around them. They get used to their process. And when they migrate or try and sort of take that next step into the future in terms of the next iteration of transformation, the focus is we just need to get to the next level of automation, or we need a platform that's going to enable the next level of growth. But it's still based on a capability, and can our processes migrate into a new system? But I think often it's the wrong question to ask. So I'll give you some examples, right? So we need a system that's going to help us procure better. Okay, fine. Any system will help you create purchase orders. Can we get to that next level of detail? Why do you need a system that's going to help you procure better? Oh, well, because we're overspending at the moment. Okay, right. What are you overspending on? Right. Well, we've got 50K in excess inventory that's just been sat on the shelves for however long, and that's where you've got it, right. So we're no longer just migrating systems, moving on to the next platform. We're improving cash flow by removing that excess inventory that's basically creating a 50K hole in our in our potential cash flow, right? So I think if, using that example, we were to then layer on your question, which is, do we believe that we will see value from a new system in 4 to 8 weeks, or whatever the metric is, you can then benchmark by saying how do we believe that the new solution is going to enable us to free up that 50K of excess inventory within 4 to 8 weeks? And then it's a lot more tangible than just, do we think that the cost of investment is going to, provide a return to us? So I think that's great advice, Liran, and I really appreciate you sharing that.
Right. And you mentioned that example with the procurement. It's also raised a very nice example from our field. We hear a lot of vendors saying, we will resolve your Excel hell, or we will, that kind of spreadsheet chaos. And it's always like a question. I don't think, if I'm putting myself in the shoes of an FP&A manager or a CFO, I don't think that I have personal problem with Excel. I have problem with the way that people are analyzing data, with the data processes, the data accuracy, the planning workflows, and so on, right? So I think that sometimes, we also need to think a little bit in that mindset. Hey, we are not trying with the EPM to solve a technology problem. We're trying to bring business value to the picture, right? And I think that's the key mindset. It could be that some of the challenges are because Excel is not the right technology. It could be. But in many cases, those are, data process and planning methods that are lacking, right? So we always need to think about, okay, what are the real business challenges? And the business challenges are not with the technology. It's usually with the way we are utilizing technology or data within the organization.
And I think, I'm just thinking about a conversation I had a few days ago as well, is a lot of the time people think that technology might be, this silver bullet that's going to solve problems, right? And you'd hope it to be, right? Especially when you start getting into some of these really heavy hitting solutions, right?
Let's use ChatGPT. It will solve everything, right? We don't need finance anymore.
It will solve everything. Yeah, that's it. So obviously using the AI example, I was on a podcast with Dan Lawrence and his guys at Bots for That called Beanies in a Pod. It's a great episode. I'll link to it in the show notes. Real fan of what they're doing at the moment. But one of the lines that came out of that conversation is that, we hold AI to higher standards than we hold ourselves, right? We expect it to be better than us, even though, that's pretty high standards, right? And I think it doesn't help that when you're investing in new solutions, especially if you're spending a lot of money, you do hold them in very high regard, right? So yes, we are investing in this system. We have done a very rigorous due diligence process. We know that we're likely to see fast time to value. But then the problem, and maybe you can comment on this as well, is sometimes on that user adoption piece, because consultants or whoever's implementing the system will have a great knowledge of the system. They might have great knowledge of your industry and be able to provide instructions on how to use it. But it's up to the organization to map the process to the way that the system works. And I think if there's another takeaway that people can sort of have a think about here is if you are undergoing any translation, there's a big argument to say that there's going to be documentation that will need to be produced alongside any implementation that helps your team understand how your process then fits in with the system, because you can't just give somebody access to a system and hope that they know how it's going to work in relation to the way that they work as a business. But it's one of the biggest gaps that you tend to see during tech implementations is that there isn't somebody that's nominated to do the documentary and do that translation piece. So just something that's come to mind as we've been talking there.
Right. And I think documentation is super critical, especially over time when you want to make also changes to the system and you want to make sure that you get the full picture on how it works. It's interesting that I do believe that some systems that are being developed today tend to be kind of a self-service in the way that you're not really expecting someone to go through a user guide, but through a more interactive way that explaining that. However, I definitely think that one of the challenges is sometimes to explain that, it could be that we find employees, very good employees in an organization that serve the organization for many years, but then you put an EPM system that requires them to think a little bit differently, right? And in those cases, it's not always just the documentation to explain them how they should be thinking differently, but also why and what's in it for them, right? I've seen many times when, there were a group of people doing some reporting to the organization and spend a lot of time for that. And when we came with a better technology to say, hey guys, instead of spending whatever 3 days at the month and to close and to create those reports, you can do it in a couple of hours. The immediate reaction was, that's could be our job secure. No, we know how to do it and our heads is work better than the machine. But then we say, hey guys, isn't it a little bit too boring for you to do that? And if you do that, you can actually do some other stuff that would be much more meaningful for the organization. You are going to be key person and not just someone in the shadows, right? So that's part sometimes of the motivation. And then, they are eager to learn and they want to learn and they want to try and to get exposed, right? So I think it's also making sure that we're giving the right motivation to people to go through that, whatever, either documentation or self-experience to use the new tool in the system.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody say, I want to spend more time on stuff. I hear plenty of times, I want to spend more time on interesting stuff, but very rarely do I hear people say, I love doing the boring repeat work. But you're right, especially to maybe people that are a little bit more set in their ways, for lack of a better phrase. There is that fear element that I think people just need to get past. There is a mindset shift that's required there. But chances are, and you probably see this as well, is people go through a tech transformation not because they're trying to save an hour a week or take half a day off their month-end close. It's a lot more drastic than that, because the team will be frazzled. Maybe they're working overtime and out of hours to meet deadlines. And then by the time one repeat activity is done, the next one's already come through the door and they're always playing catch up. So I think coming back to what you're saying there about positioning this is, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't feel like you're always playing catch up? Wouldn't it be nice if you could actually finish at 5 o'clock and sit down and have dinner with your family? Do you see what I mean? And I think people often jump to the absolute max end of the scale that is, I'm going to lose my job. Whereas in fact, the mindset needs to be, actually, I work really hard. There's a load of stuff that I'm doing that just isn't producing any value. There's a load of stuff that I could be doing that's going to progress my career and allow me to establish a firmer footprint in the organization. Yeah, I'd love to do that. And I don't think anybody in an organization that you report to or anybody at a senior level is going to think, yeah, I don't want them working on the value add stuff. I'd rather them just do the repeat stuff. It just doesn't work like that, does it?
Right, and that's true. And there is another way of looking at that. So a couple of years ago, I heard people in the EPM space using the term "we give you the time back," right? And I was kind of a bit hesitating with that sort of a statement. I don't think that EPM vendors or consultants are giving time back. We're not time lords, but I think, right? But I think that what we actually do, we're giving you the ability to be more productive. And I think that over time, the organization expecting people to be more productive, right? So sometimes, when I'm going to, let's call it the more conservative people in the space, and I'm offering them an advanced solution, I'm saying, hey, guys, you don't have to use an advanced solution, but the expectation of the management is for you to create at least 6 more insights to them, right? So if you right now have a financial dashboard, they're expecting to see the financial dashboard with some procurement information, HR insights, sales pipeline, and analysis. If you can do that without the proper technology, be my guest. You can do that. That's fine. Then you don't, but right, and then it's. But if you do want to be able and meet those goals that the management set for you, you have to utilize that technology. So in many ways, I think a way to think about technology, it's not always giving us time back, but it helps us to be more productive. That's why, when we started to get emails and all that kind of stuff, it didn't really help us to get home at 5, but it helped us to be more responsive and to do more. So I think that's a little bit of a different approach, that you can literally help the people to be more productive. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, we don't own time, but we can own productivity.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's it. I'd love to be a time lord.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
I don't know why I was thinking that you would love that, but okay.
Yeah, but actually, coming back to the time to value, because one of the points you mentioned there was some of these systems should be self-serve, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Yeah, and what we were talking about there, obviously, was some of the heavier hitting platforms that there is a translation, especially if it's not an it's a step change, right, to do that. But I have to give it a shout out, because I do have an example of immediate time to value, and some of the podcast guests have mentioned it before. Because I'll ask you the question a bit later, about the tech and the gadgets that you use. But it's something called Motion, and I'm not affiliated with them. Use Motion, and it's an AI calendar scheduling app, and it's so simple. Basically, you just drop in your tasks, tell it how long the tasks are going to last, how high a priority they are, and what your deadlines are, and then it just drops them all into your calendar. Because the theory is, a task is one thing, unless it's in your calendar, it's not going to get actioned. So it kind of bridges that gap. I saw a value in that. So my time to value for that was less than half a day.
Wow.
You see what I mean? And that is a self-serve tool. And that's not, it's not anything to do with finance. It could be to do with finance, because I hear they do, a team version now whereby you could potentially, do all of your little month-end tasks as a team, and it will use AI to schedule what needs to happen when. So that might be a use case for finance. But I thought I'd throw it in there, because that's one of the systems that you probably wouldn't need to document, because it's more of a productivity self-serve type thing. So yeah, we just need to be clear on what the threshold is. The only thing that I might say, if you're using some of these more self-service tools, is at the very least document the landscape. Yeah, so how do they interact with each other? Yeah, so for planning, we use this. This process is still done in Excel, but, it's not 20 Excel worksheets anymore. It's just 1 or 2. This is what we use for the operational stuff, and this is our BI tool, and this is how they all sync together. So I think that's a good exercise if you've not already documented it.
Right, and it's on one hand it's so basic, right? Like, hey, we need to document where processes, how processes are being done, I was actually like 10, 15 years ago, I was working with a vendor that did like process management solution where you can literally do a write up very easy, like, like a visual style,
Yeah.
but literally doing that to document processes and see how they work. As much as it's basic, very few organizations that I met are really doing that.
Mm.
And at most cases where you really want to know how process is really working, or what is the flow of data or some information, you eventually need to sit up with a couple of people that most of that information is in their head, right? And even those who are documenting that, it's very seldom that you will find the proper, easy to understand, updated documentation, right? So either it's going to be too lengthy, or it's going to be not up to date, or missing, right? So I definitely agree with you that documentation should be available, should be done in a simple way that could be allowing to maintain it over time.
Mm. Um, and this is one of the use cases where it's easier to use AI. Because one of the issues I've still got with AI, whether it's ChatGPT, Claude, Bard, whatever it happens to be, it's all multi-tenant, it's all in the cloud, and there's still concerns over data, right? So my recommendation is just use it without any sensitive data. But it doesn't take any effort now just to plug a question into ChatGPT to say, look, give me a framework I can use for a process map. Give me the questions that I need to ask the team, tell me how to structure it, and then it can at least give you that framework. It could then even go to the next step to give you at least the document layout. And then if you feel comfortable, because the systems you use isn't really sensitive, chances are your organization is going to use something for finance, something for planning, or whatever, obviously not company data, but just in terms of systems, you could say, these are the systems that we use. This is roughly the way that we interact. Please provide a documentation with a little bit more detail that shows this. And then you can take that away. You can update it, share it with the team, and make sure that it's precise. So I'm seeing the production of base level documentation, at least going about that process, is a lot quicker. So that should hopefully give people something to take away in terms of not thinking that they have to start from scratch with everything. The tools are now available where you can template some stuff and at least have a starting point that's going to speed things up if you're at capacity already.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. And I heard the interesting conversation between one of my colleague professors in the university and his students. He said that, hey, like when we're thinking about the AI, when we started to use word processing or spreadsheets, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't allowed initially to be used in university or for students, right? You still had to submit your work by handwriting. Then the word processing came and email and so on, and you find, okay, there is no reason to fight that. So it could be that what you mentioned with those templates, that's literally a next sort of a generation. It will not fill up the process for you, but it can give you a better framework to start with.
Yeah.
And probably needless to say, but I will say that it still requires a lot of human mind to validate what sort of template do you get, or they're comprehensive enough. So don't just take the shortcuts of the AI without validating it.
Oh yeah, 100%. Because it doesn't know your business. Maybe one day it will. And I am a believer that pretty soon we're going to start hiring AI in the same way that we do people, because there'll be specific AIs that are good at certain tasks, whether it's a virtual assistant or booking holidays or whatever it happens to be, and you can just pick and choose what you want to use. So there might be an AI that comes up that's a finance bot with a specialism in hospitality. Yeah, in which case, when you ask it a question, it already understands the context, right? But we're still a way away. Latest ChatGPT iteration does provide a bit of that context, so you can give it a bit of background on you, so that you're not having to be as explicit when you instruct it. But again, coming back to what you've said, you've just got to be careful on what sort of data you feed into it. But next iteration will be Microsoft Copilot, where they're building ChatGPT into Excel and Word. And I think that's going to be exactly the use case that we've spoken about there. You'll have, you remember Clippy in Word, the little paper clip that came up in the corner to guide you through stuff and that sort of stuff. Be Clippy 2.0, whereby you've got a little chat at the bottom that says, oh, looks like you're trying to write so-and-so. Would you like me to pre-populate a template for you, and that sort of stuff? So you're absolutely right. The next generation, my kids, your kids, they'll get used to it, and it doesn't mean that they won't have a job. It just means that they'll be focusing on more exciting stuff. And that's my hope anyway.
Yeah, and again, I think it will be just more about that piece of productivity. They will need to produce more because it's not that they will be expected to work less hours a day, I believe. I think they will just be expected to produce more during a working day and maybe do a more accurate job, right? In that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So going back for a second, so we talked about time to value, and then we went off on a bit of an AI rabbit hole, is what normally happens in these sessions. But going back to, I guess, business case and making sure that we're being mindful of costs, I guess, because, we work in finance, we're trying to get to the point where we're business partners and we're, building value as opposed to just being, bean counters and just thinking about how much we're spending all the time. But nevertheless, we do need to be mindful of costs, especially for larger applications that are going to be a considerable investment, right? So I want to come back to one of your publications, and you're going to have to explain these acronyms, right? So we've got software project costing, coupling CMMI and PMBOK into a generic costing framework. So can you break that down a bit for us and just give us the highlights, and then I'll put the link to it in the show notes.
Right. So let's just start from one step before that.
Go on.
If we want to understand if our company is profitable or not, knowing what's the revenue is usually fairly simple, but understanding your cost structure is a little bit more complicated, right?
Yes.
Now, if we think about a manufacturing planet, right? Manufacturing planet, there are a bunch of ways. So, if you're talking about the manufacturing revolution, right? That was already ages ago. So people over time have been able to understand how you can do a proper costing for a product. And if your planet has thousands of SKUs, then, there are different ways on how you can allocate cost and think about that for each and every SKU. When we're talking about projects, software projects as an example, that becomes a little bit more complicated. Now, it becomes complicated because there are a lot of different chefs in the kitchen. Because on one hand, you have those guys that, are the architects or software engineers and so on. They have their own way to think about costing, right? They say, well, I have a development team that is offshore, so it's a little bit less expensive than the nearshore one, right? And they are looking usually on that piece, but they forget that if it's a project that needs to get sold later on or a product, then there are some sales and marketing costs to allocate into that, right? So those are a little bit outside of them. That CMMI, by the way, is one of methodologies that software engineers are usually use. It's it goes side by side with CMMI for different other areas. But the idea is that we have software engineers that know how to do costing in one way. Then we have the project management officers, right? The PMO, project management office, and there is PM book with those methods of project management, and they have a different way about thinking on how you do project costing and how you might be doing like cost allocation and so on, right? So they're looking on that mostly from, let's say, the milestone perspective and other ways. And at the other side, you get again those accounting and finance professional, the FP&A guys that we used to work with them so much, and they have a little bit of different perspective and needs when they do cost allocation. Now, when we speak about one product or one project, I don't think it's super sophisticated. It's definitely doable. But when you think about a company with a portfolio of products, or if you think about an implementation consulting firm that runs sometimes dozens or hundreds of projects in parallel, that way it becomes a little bit more complicated, right? That is where you say, okay, so let's say that my offshore team is fully packed and I have only local resources. What does it mean? Does it mean that the next project I'm going to do is necessarily more expensive than the one I'm doing now just because my team is not available, right? This is one question. Or if we do have a concept of a very strategic customer that we want to sell him a project, and then we do a heavy discount on that project. What does it mean that this project is losing money and the other are earning money, right? Those are type of dilemmas that everyone who is getting deep into the profitability and costing analysis will be asking. So overall, the idea in that research that I was doing was to say, okay, we do have several different frameworks. Each one of those frameworks is coming from a little bit of a different need, but what I try to do in my research is to think about that in a more holistic way and in a more business-oriented way that, okay, how do we take the good at each word, right? So as an example, the CMMI, if you think about software costing from an engineering perspective, if you're really following that, there are methods that allows you to do very accurate calculations on how long and how many resources you will need to build the project. And then there are some methodologies in the cost accounting area that helps you on how to do a proper allocation. So if you merge the good of all worlds, you might be getting a more holistic framework, right? So that was kind of that work of research. And again, it was coupling those different type of methodologies. Each one of them is a sort of a mini silo by itself. And what we want to do is usually breaking those silos for the greater good.
Okay. And apologies. So obviously we were looking at that from the perspective of a company that produces software. So that was my misunderstanding. So I apologize for that. But just thinking a little bit outside the box for people who are procuring software, are there any, I guess, methodologies or preferable delivery mechanisms that might be more cost-effective approaches? So you said there some companies might offshore some of the work, and I've actually seen that recently, whereby some solution vendors have said, right, well, you can have a UK-based consultant, and it's going to cost you, 70 grand, or you can have somebody in South Africa for 50. So does it pay to ask those questions, do you think, when you're negotiating a software contract, to say, right, well, is there any way that we could, procure a more cost-effective resource if we're not bothered about having somebody on site with us? Is there any advantage to us, ring fencing, 10 days next month? Is there any way that we can have a negotiation around that? Because in terms of commitment and, all of that sort of stuff. So do you think there's any wins from the other perspective, the people that are procuring the software, that might help sort of negotiate contracts?
I think it's an excellent question. Let me, before answering directly to that, take one step above. I think the whole question of cost structure is so interesting. Where I've been working with hundreds of customers in the FP&A field, and I think that the majority of the projects is so focusing on the P&L mindset and not necessarily on the cost components or the drivers or how to look at those, right? So I think what you're asking is that, hey, if we get a little bit more sensitive to the cost structure and the cost component, right, can we achieve any better maybe cost structure? And the answer is of course, but you need to be really sensitive about that, and you need to evaluate the different alternatives. But you definitely need to have that type of a framework where you can analyze them, right? And if you say, well, maybe if I'm having an offshore resource, I will need to spend more on travel, right? So you have to make sure that you get that in your sort of evaluation criteria. Or, well, I'm hiring someone in a different time zone. Is it really doable for me? Because if I need to interact with them, right? So I think that the whole idea is again, it's not to focus just on the alternative cost. Well, a local consultant will be more expensive than an offshore one, but what are the overheads, right? So the overall idea is, always try to get the big picture.
Yeah. And you're dead right. There are some areas where you can actually damage a relationship if you try and negotiate too hard as well. Because I find quite often that solutions are priced at a rate according to the value that they provide. Yeah, obviously sometimes arguments happen if there is a misrepresentation of value, i.e. poor salesperson, commission-hungry salesperson, and so on and so forth. But what I also find is, and I've had this before actually, whereby companies might offer a dirt cheap day rate, for example, but then you just get given a junior consultant, and that means that, your day rate might be lower, but the project might be twice as long because they're not as experienced, and it takes them twice as long to develop exactly the same system as somebody who's slightly more senior. So I think we're aligned there in terms of thinking about just be careful. If you do negotiate hard, just beware that there might be consequences in terms of the quality of the deliverability at the other end.
My first experience with that was in my first home. I had a small garden, and I had to buy a mower. So I went to the store and I asked the guy there. I told him I need the cheapest one, right?
Yeah.
And the guy was looking at me and said, "It looks like you're rich enough to save, right?" So.
That's a great story. Yeah, no, but very good, very good. So I'm conscious of your time, Liran. So one of the questions I was going to ask an AI question, but we've kind of tackled the AI piece a little bit. Unless you've got any sort of final thoughts from the work that you've been doing recently. I mean, from my perspective, and I did a post about this recently, is I'm still not seeing a huge amount of people mention AI as top priority in their organization. So I've spoken to quite a lot, and it's just not been discussed, maybe because they think it's still too far off, or they don't understand it, or where it happens to be. But I guess from your experience and what you're doing now, are you seeing people sort of becoming more focused in sort of an FP&A sense, I guess? Or, what does the next iteration look like if more FP&A professionals started adopting AI? I don't know whether you've got any thoughts around that.
So I think we need to check over the past decade, let's say, and see different hypes that we had, right? We had a huge hype with big data. And I remember the claim over there, everyone is talking about big data, but no one is using it or something like that, right? Or doing it. So and I heard that, by the way, also over the past couple of years, people saying exactly the same about AI. I believe that on one hand, there is a sort of an evolution and revolution that is happening, and we cannot ignore it. Is it really happening right now? It's a little bit more hard to tell. I would be more hesitating to say, yes, that revolution is happening now. But I'm thinking about that, when we just started to see the BI tools out there, right? Mm-hmm. Then many people said, hey, I don't need a dashboard. I'm okay with the reports I have. But once people are starting to get dashboards and starting to get used to that, they cannot do anything without it, right? I remember even myself, I used to build dashboards for myself just because it's so easy and nice to use. I think with AI, it's the same, right? Once executive, are starting to use AI, and, one executive is seeing with his colleagues how nice, like he asked a system, what was my revenue growth over the past months? And he get an answer and a nice chart, then the other guy is starting. So I think we will see that coming maybe more as a trend. I'm sure that executive will push more and more over FP&A departments not to use just their mindset, but also to use the engines. And I think that the more traditional FP&A professional will have to start adopting that. We see those great AI tools coming up with Office and tools, right? So I see that adoption coming in and doing a change. I don't think that it's mature enough to say that it's happening now, because most organizations will tell you, hey, we have so many data issues to take care of first before the machine can analyze the data for us. But then AI will start taking care of some data cleansing and some data interaction, right? So I think that sort of revolution is happening. It will still going to take time until it will fully adopted. And I'm absolutely sure that executives will start to push their teams to use that more and more, because they, I think modern executive never wants to stay behind, and they will not be able to allow their organization not to utilize tools that are available here and now, right? There is no doubt that those tools are available. There is more doubt about the scope of their contribution.
Yeah, and it's one of those scenarios where, I agree. I think when people start using it, that there's just no going back, and unfortunately it's too late for me, right? I'm fully in the AI bandwagon, and it's now, part of who I am. but I always recommend, the quick wins come first, right? AI transcriptions for meeting notes. It's so easy now to have an auto transcript and the AI just pull out whatever the next actions were. Then you don't have to think about noting down your next steps, and it just is so much more fluid. From an FP&A perspective, I've done a couple of posts about it. As soon as you're using something like Notable, the ChatGPT plugin or ChatGPT code interpreter, even if it's just with dummy data, the speed that you can now Q&A the data to start producing visualizations, and I think as soon as people start doing that more and more, there's going to be no option, as you say, for that wave to keep on getting bigger and bigger, right, to the point where there's no option. But I'd say that the biggest gap at the moment is still data, and I'm waiting to get to the point where organizations can easily build their own private tenant with these AI tools in them. But at the moment, we're still a way off unless you've got some sort of heavy IT experience in the team. So anyway, watch this space. We'll see where we go. So no, that's been great. So I'll ask you the question that I ask all of my guests, Liran. So the show's called Tech for Finance. I love my gadgets, my phone apps, my browser extensions. I've mentioned one already, use Motion, right? So, and it can be in your professional or your personal life. Do you have an app on your phone, a gadget, software application that you literally just couldn't live without?
So I have dozens. It's a very tough question in my case, and I'm always trying new ones. And I'm very rarely remove something from my gadget list, whether that's a physical one or not.
Yes.
I would refer into to right. So in my, let's say, in professional life within the organization, I will not give away on what I call productivity tools, Monday.com style.
Yeah.
I think organizing so many tasks with so many different functions in the organization, it's impossible to do in traditional ways. And you need to get something that is thinking a little bit out of the box to consider the tasks. So, I definitely think that, those type of productivity tool, I really like what you mentioned earlier about that tool with the scheduling. I will probably check it out. So from organizational standpoint, for sure that. From a personal perspective, the most critical one, I have a sort of a way where I'm managing my calendar with Calendly and the note-taking and making sure that all the knowledge about my meetings and insight and call to actions are all together. I cannot live without that. So I think that's the personal kind of productivity versus the organizational productivity piece.
And that's Calendly, yeah?
It's the combination that I'm using with, Calendly, note-taking, and the calendar management. Yes, gotcha. It's like all of them together allows my calendar and my time management to be superior.
Yeah, very good. And you can, so Motion as well, and I'll stop talking about Motion soon, but I've just started using it, right? So I'm still in that giddy, it's bright, shiny and new territory. But it's got a meeting booking link as well. But what's cool is if it knows what your priorities are, when you send the meeting link through to give you availability, it will suggest better times than others. So in the meeting link, it will say, we've got this availability. These 2 slots are preferable if you can do them. But if not, at a push, we can do time number 3, right? And of course, you're not going to stop people from clicking 3, but it's nice to have that, this is preferred, this is not. So that's quite interesting. So yeah, check it out. It's 7-day free trial. It's not the cheapest of productivity apps, but in terms of, they're trying to say that it's literally going to free up a day a week. I'm kind of seeing it at the moment, but what I'm finding actually is not that it's freeing up a day a week. It's just shunting all of the lower priority tasks that I hadn't scheduled further forward. So, it is what it is.
So maybe, something nice to mention. In my perspective, time is only a matter of priorities, right?
Yeah.
So it's all about like, how do you manage time? And, for some of us in the knowledge space, time is the most, expensive resource. So if we get something that helps us to manage time better, probably can do better and enjoy better, our professional and personal life.
Yeah. You can make more money, but you can't make more time.
That's right.
As cheesy as the quote goes, it's 100% true. And it's only when, as you know, with some pretty severe restrictions on your time, I'm sure, it's only when you actually start mapping the amount of time that you spend on certain stuff that you appreciate just how valuable it is. Because I'm now getting into the territory where I'm thinking of, actually, I can now see when I'm likely to finish something now that something's planning it for me. And so it's kind of a light bulb moment, because I'm now realizing, right, well, actually, why would I ever do that? Because this is so much more important. This is going to move me so much more forwards than the sort of lower stuff that's just creating the noise. Do you see what I mean? But sometimes it's not until you see it in the calendar, in your time, that you actually appreciate how valuable or not it is. And that's the last thing I'll say is that, even if you don't use motion, I would proactively try and get your to-do list onto a time block in a calendar, even if you do it manually, because that's the only way that you're going to visualize just how much time you consume. And the other thing as well that I found as well is beginning to use, the create task and then apply an estimated time to complete the task.
Right.
Over the past week, I have been drastically underestimating the amount of time that it takes to do stuff properly. So actually, when you think to yourself, oh, it'll only take me half an hour to do that, it's not going to take half an hour to do that. I'd say it's at least 50%, if not 100% more than the allocated time that you think it's going to take to do something.
Right. That's usually why you will end up your working day, I don't know, at 9 p.m. rather than 5, right? It's usually those underestimation. And also from an organization or from more like a management or executive perspective, I think we have to remember that a lot of employees in the teams we're working with are not experienced enough to manage their time, right? It could be that they are great developers, great presenters, great FP&A guys, but it doesn't mean that they have that sort of time management capabilities. And then, talking about those features, gadgets, AI, whatever, that those, just happen to be better.
But, what we're talking about with these tools now is, we've basically got virtual assistants in digital form. Right? And I only see more of that, and I will actively encourage all of those quick wins, because, this now also translates into my personal life, because I've got a to-do list as long as my arm for stuff that I need to do as a family, stuff with the house and all that sort of stuff. And anything that I can do to make sure that I'm doing that, means that everybody's happy, right? And that's what, I'm struggling less now, but that's what I've always struggled with is, you get so involved with what you're passionate about, your work and all of that sort of stuff, you kind of sometimes take your family as a given, and I'm guilty of that, and I feel horrible saying it, but it's amazing what happens when you literally stick to the deadlines that you give yourself to spending time with family. There's just a lightness that comes from you being able to say wholeheartedly, this is my time for them, so it's been really refreshing.
It's a task by itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, Liran, absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Where can people find more about you?
I think LinkedIn would be the easiest way, and I'm always super responsive and happy to get new connections and new conversations. So anyone with any question, idea, or motion, I'll be more than happy to get a ping from you on my LinkedIn and chat with you. Yeah.
Perfect. So I'll put your LinkedIn profile in the show notes, as well as I'll put links through to your publications as well. I know they're in your LinkedIn profile, but just so for easy access for other people. But once again, really appreciate you coming on. It's been an excellent conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Adam. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
No worries at all.